Thus, the uniqueness of black religion is the racial bond which seeks to risk its life for the elusive but ultimate goal of freedom and equality by means of protest and action. It does so through the only avenues to which its members have always been permitted a measure of access: religious convocations in the fields or in the houses of worship. And I think maybe I can make it a little bit more by talking about how, or going maybe to starting somewhere in the mid-1700s by what Al Rabito calls the invisible institution of slave religion. And even though I'm starting in slavery, I seldom do any talks or any teaching without starting in Africa, because the history and the ethos and the contributions didn't just spring up out of soil on this continent, but in fact did originate on the African continent. But interestingly enough, New Orleans is a bit different from the rest of the South for two reasons. At least two reasons. One is that there was repeated cultural reinforcement of African arts and ritual in a locale Freddie Evans identifies as Place Publique, Place des Nègres, Place Cirque, Circus Park, Circus Place, Circus Square, Congo Park, Place Congo, Congo Plains, Place d'Armes, Beauregard Square, Negroes, Negro Square, or Congo Square. The other factor was the presence and the influence of Roman Catholicism, which continues to affect the religious worship of the city to this day. As the religions, plural, of Africans in America continue to evolve, the indoor mode, the invisible institution of slave religion, was in many instances outside, but the indoor mode was experienced as praise houses or prayer houses, sometimes on plantations and sometimes elsewhere. Pearl Williams Jones, in a short-lived publication called Spirit, cited again Washington, who defined these praise houses as the special meeting houses for slaves instituted on a limited number of plantations where these slaves could express themselves through worship, linking arms and crossing their feet. And although he says cross their feet, the slave did not cross their feet actually as we understand it, because that's dancing. And they would not be dancing, known as shuffling. Marches, shouts, sermons, camp meeting songs, hymns, and spirituals. Relatively free from whites there in praise nights or praise or prayer meetings, those so fortunate could rejoice in the Lord. Following the Nat Turner insurrection in 1831, however, the small number of praise houses were reduced even further. What did they do? What was important about this mode of worship? In an rendering of it, but I think it rings true. The religious worship services and rituals of the service were freely structured around prayers, praise, and preaching, and they show minimal influences of their white counterparts. The black folk church is one in which improvisational music is an integral part of all aspects of ritual. It is basically not a congregation of hymn book singing tradition. Instrumental accompaniment is usually present to lend emphasis to the inevitable hand clapping, foot patting, and shouting percussive rhythms. Freedom of the worshipers is encouraged in testimonies, prayers, and praise, and in any manner the propagation of gospel, which is a 20th century phenomenon. And maybe I ought to take a minute and say that with what may have been called the Third Great Awakening, Sankey and Moody, that goes from the end of the 19th century into the early part of the 20th century, there is this continued camp meeting, revivalistic kind of style of worship. And Charles Albert Tindley is one of the first persons to put together a gospel hymn. Now that's in contradistinction to what's been called the gospel song. But in any case, all of this is at the end of the 1800s. What we call the spiritual, the Negro spiritual, the black spiritual, the African American spiritual, is something that comes, again, out of the slave religion experience with some contact with this camp meeting revival experience. But this happened as early as the 18th century and then into the 19th century. So gospel music, particularly as championed by Thomas A. Dorsey, who's considered the father of gospel music, is a 20th century phenomenon. There's a denominational support that it gets. Blacks generally, as they moved into denominations, were evangelized by the Baptists and the Methodists. But a third area is generally left out, and that's what I want to end with, and that's the so-called sanctified church. Now, the sanctified church, according to Zora Neale Hurston and a number of others, is comprised basically of three main trajectories: holiness, Pentecostal, and what may be called apostolic. The holiness movement, when blacks began to move into that denominationally, is the extension of the Wesleyan Methodism, which was a corrective on Methodism that John Wesley said needed to happen. We weren't really following what we needed to follow. And so there was a general holiness movement. Blacks began to adhere to that with the notion of sanctification, set apartness, holiness, as being the major piece of that. And so Charles Price Jones and C.P. Jones and Charles Harrison Mason actually put together the Church of Christ, which was would be a holiness denomination. Interestingly, C.H. Mason, at the turn of the century, goes to the Azusa Street revival in Pentecostalism. Well, the interesting thing is that Mahalia Jackson went to two Baptist churches, Plymouth Rock and Mount Moriah. One was earlier in her life, the other was later. But she also had a house right next door to one of the sanctified churches, this holiness church. And let me just read this, this and another quote will conclude what I have to say. In her 1966 autobiography, Moving On Up, Mahalia Jackson wrote with Evan McLeod Wiley, paid homage to this sanctified church and its traditions. She said, "I know now that a great influence in my life was the sanctified or holiness churches we had in the South. I was always a Baptist, but there was a sanctified church right next door to our house in New Orleans. Those people had no choir and no organ. They used the drum, the cymbal, the tambourine, and the steel triangle. Everyone in there sang and they clapped and stomped their feet and sang with their whole bodies. They had a beat, a powerful beat, a rhythm we held on to from slavery days, and their music was so strong and expressive, it used to bring tears to my eyes. I believe the blues and jazz and even the rock and roll stuff got their beat from the sanctified church. We Baptists sang sweet, and we had the long and short meter on beautiful songs like Amazing Grace, How Sweet It Sounds. But when those holiness people tore into I'm so glad Jesus lifted me up, they came out with real jubilation." So she pays homage to that tradition, and I didn't really get a chance to show how this also was part of the tradition of resistance and civil rights. But here's an interesting piece. When the ministers in Chicago were too afraid to invite Martin Luther King Jr. to come and speak, Mahalia invited him. Mahalia Jackson brought him there. And so I close with this. Speech draft writer and advisor to Dr. King, attorney Clarence B. Jones, recounts a behind-the-scenes exchange that took place on the occasion of Martin Luther King Jr.'s address at the Lincoln Memorial for the March on Washington for Jobs and Freedom, August 28, 1963. Ms. Jackson had sung the Negro spiritual, I've Been Buked and I've Been Scorned, earlier in the program. King came to the podium to deliver what he and Attorney Jones had worked on and was delivering rather effectively. Then, as Jones told the New Orleans Times-Picayune midway through the speech, one of the world's greatest gospel singers shouted out to one of the world's greatest Baptist preachers, "Tell him about the dream, Martin. Tell him about the dream." Without missing a beat, King, who had called on Jackson many times to encourage him with her musical ministry and gift, put aside his papers and, as we black preachers say, shifted gears. Jones said, he told somebody next to him, standing next to him, "These people don't know it, but they're about to go to church."
The life and the work of Mahalia Jackson. That in itself is very powerful stuff, and it happens to fall on the day of the 50th anniversary of Bloody Sunday. Wow. Very heartfelt to me, so if I tear up, excuse me. I think of Mahalia Jackson, I think of Aunt Duke screaming, "Haley, get back here and wash these dishes, girl!" I mean, these were down-home folks with down-home daily responsibilities, and they had business to take care of. My work comes from my life, the people I've known, the great honor I've had in working with so many people, and through my own research. Carrollton, the section of town that Mahalia came from, grew up in. I mean, I'm a person who lived in Treme on and off for 25 years. All right, there might be some people argue Treme has a lot to be thankful for my contributions to Treme. I don't know about that. But anyway, I truly find Carrollton one of the most fascinating places I've ever researched in my life. It's phenomenal. You know, Mahalia was born probably about a half mile away during Water Street and Leek, right along the river. Her family came from Point Coupe, came around 1900. Porter, one of her uncles, first came, as the story goes, and landed in that part of town, and then shortly after, the family came. And of course, Mahalia being born in 1911, you know, I got to once go, oh man, let me tell you, I ramble and I jump around, so apologies from the beginning. I got to go in the 70s with Thomas Dorsey to Mahalia's tomb there at Providence Memorial Park, and it was a major event for Thomas Dorsey to go. And it was a major event for me, a very young man who had a great love and interest in black culture, and in culture in general, to be honest with you. But those type of events made me realize even more how heartfelt and the impact of Mahalia. Carrollton is a neighborhood, well, one that I think Mahalia today, look, I do have a few notes, I won't improvise entirely. I do want to say that I think today Mahalia would be very supportive and very active in Black Lives Matters. You know, Michelle Alexander wrote this tremendous book called The New Jim Crow, Mass Incarceration. A really phenomenal book, and I think that most people who grew up in New Orleans and or many parts of Louisiana would know that in a very sad way, great amounts of Jim Crow never flew away. It's nothing new. It goes on day after day. And lived right there in the neighborhood too, whenever she was a child. And the Tuxedo was always one of her favorite brass bands. And as we all know, that song, the second liner, Joe Avery's Blues, if something was going to inspire bounce, that was inspire enough bounce for you right there. You know, people have a hard idea conceiving today resistance from 100 years ago, but things were slower. People didn't let time rule them as much as they ruled time. And the industrial age didn't have as great an impact on our every moment of awake life. So, you know, they took things a little bit slower. And I mean, I've heard recordings of Mardi Gras Indians, of which there was a tribe, the Red, White, and Blue Eagles, that was a block and a half from where Mahalia lived on Pitt Street also. Recordings from them in the 50s, and then I've heard the earliest recording of the Mardi Gras Indian tribe that I have is 1932. And I mean, it's so mild by today's standards. You know, in a way, when you first hear it, you're approaching it, you're thinking, oh, well, this is so sedate. This isn't no, you know, social rebellion, revolution in the streets, you know, but it is. Just the act of them doing it, it really was, you know. And so, even though it was much milder, so it didn't take much bounce in the music for Mahalia to have to fight for her musical life amongst the Baptist convention. See if there's any real point. I mean, she pretty much grew up and lived through the age and disenchantment. You should know as well that, I mean, as a child here in New Orleans, she witnessed the influenza epidemic, one of the greatest disease outbreaks in the history of mankind as we know it. Over 5,000 people died in New Orleans, with over 250,000 people having gotten ill. World War I and the continued history of black soldiering took place. Prohibition, the Great Depression coming on. Point two, because this relates to what it was like at that time, is that, you know, everybody says, well, she had to leave school when she was 13. Well, if you were black, you were not allowed in a public school to go beyond the 6th grade at that time. And so, you know, it's like, and that's sort of how the stories tell, oh, she had to leave school and go to work when she was 13. I mean, everything you read about Mahalia says this. Instead of saying, in New Orleans, you were only allowed to go to school up into the 6th grade if you were relying on public school. So, I mean, she got her education. And of course, education was very important to people in the family, I believe. I mean, it's not many census records you read where you see everybody on both sides, maternal and paternal side of the family, especially people who came out of slavery, who everybody can read and write. And I believe that they were being honest when they checked that off on the census. So education was very important. The Depression, and I'll close up with a bizarre, this one will throw you for a loop, but also in New Orleans, just one other way that they then chose to try to control people during Mahalia's time in New Orleans, which was another pressure that she saw, you know, way prior to in other parts of the country. This is where marijuana was first criminalized in 1925. And it was one other way of the institution of authority in the city to pick on minorities, especially blacks and especially Latinos in the city, and incarcerate them. Because we know that Mahalia very early on was going to prison. She was singing for, as she described, dope fiends. And it was her great pleasure to do so. And she was very sad that they were incarcerated. And I mean, I believe that what Mahalia, and I'll wrap it up with this, but this is a really important point, and I think it relates to the music, jazz, and gospel. And is, to me, what keeps me incredibly fascinated every day is that these people who were, the first black judge ever elected in Louisiana, an old friend of mine, he told me once, he said, you know, he said, we know they love to keep the black folk down. But he says, you know, in New Orleans, they had their head on the back of your neck and your face was in the mud. You know, and, you know, the rate of incarceration in New Orleans then and now, I mean, New Orleans is the second most incarcerated place on planet Earth today, period. You know, those things that are being revealed from the work done in Ferguson and all of that, it's been going on here so long, it is terrible. And Mahalia was aware of that this is what was going on with people on her economic level that she moved in her circles while she was living here in the city. I mean, prior to Katrina, it's probably about the same. New Orleans incarcerated an average of 90,000 people a year at Orleans Parish Prison. many of those repeat within the silence was not going to solve the problem. It wasn't going to work. They had tried it with resurrections before. The last was terrible. It wasn't a resurrection, it was just a procession in an attempt to rewrite the state constitution in 1866 was a massacre of black people and people fighting for black rights in the city of New Orleans. The federal government only said, well, 400 people were murdered, but everybody felt it was much more than that. But they knew this. They knew it wasn't going to work, and so what they did is they created these phenomenal expressions that, one, were healing the pain of themselves and the pain that people were going through, and it was healing their enemies' pain as well by creating this incredible music, the voice of Mahalia Jackson, her ability to rejoice, make a joyful song unto the Lord. Jazz did that. It is joy. It's resistance through the expression of love and joy and kindness. And really the Indians did that in resistance through beauty. And in those ways, I think you tie all that together. And that, to not all be just bitter. I mean, man, if I go out there and step on somebody's foot right now, they're going to get mad at me generally, you know? And I don't know of many situations where Anglos in this country ever got attacked and they weren't very extremely bitter and their expression was...
Dr. Joyce Marie Jackson is Professor of Anthropology and Director of African American Studies at LSU. She's researched black culture extensively, including on the forced relocation of African Americans from their community in Fazenville, Louisiana, as well as Mardi Gras Indians and gospel quartets and other gospel music. Please welcome her from LSU, Joyce Jackson.
Thank you, Matt, for inviting me to be a part of this panel and to my friends again. But I would just like to include another genre of music that Mahalia listened to, particularly being in the Baptist church, and that's quartets and groups, because there was another very strong base of the quartet style here in New Orleans. Birmingham was another place where it was a very strong quartet base with many groups that came out of that area. But most people don't know it, but New Orleans was a very strong quartet area also, and so I just want to talk about that for a little bit. Well, we know that gospel music states the truth and bridges a message of good news, according to some writers, singers, and preachers. And the music joyousness and attention to the concerns of life, while in preparation for the next, has a more immediate optimistic application than those of many spirituals. Today, because of this view of life's experiences, gospel music in and outside of the church is an important part of the lives of many African Americans. And I wanted to talk about that part, that's sort of, some people look at it as being outside of the church, although many of these groups were formed outside of the church, but they performed a lot in the church. So the first significant point is the development of gospel in New Orleans was the organizations of the a cappella Jubilee quartets. When the early development of these groups, they didn't call themselves gospel music, they didn't call themselves gospel quartets. They were known as Jubilee quartets. They were not performing with instruments initially, and they were strictly a cappella. And the first documented a cappella quartet to be organized was at a university in Louisiana, was at New Orleans University, and presently, now it's Dillard University, but this was in 1914. It was actually the first group to be organized. And during this time, the groups performed spirituals and art songs in the style of the Fifth Jubilee singers. But in later years, they began to add Protestant hymns and gospel songs. In one quartet at Dillard, the Frederick Hall Quartet changed its name to the Delta Rhythm Boys and continued to perform after they left the university. They traveled widely and began to add secular songs to their repertoire. Southern University, first established in New Orleans in 1880, organized a university quartet which was initially recorded in 1935. And the Southern University Quartet was recorded by Bluebird Recording Company on a field trip with a mobile recording unit. The University Jubilee Quartet and ensembles influenced the development of some of the independent community-based quartets. And the community-based groups were not formally connected with the educational institutions, although some were started by and drew part of their membership from the university singers. Others were organized in churches by family members and at the workplace. In the rural areas surrounding New Orleans, there were several sugar refineries in the region. The American Sugar Refinery in Arabi, it was a rural area, well, sort of outside of New Orleans down the River Road, was founding workplace for the Four Great Wonders Quartet. James Payne, who was also a quartet trainer, and if you will look at a lot of these quartets and groups, many of them worked with trainers. They had people who, you know, who quote unquote knew music. And many of the trainers became famous for being trainers, and people would look for them and be happy to study with them. So James Payne was one of those, but he began harmonizing with friends from his neighborhood, who were also fellow workers at the sugar refinery. And Professor J.W. Williams, an itinerant chorister who, like Payne, moved to New Orleans from rural Mississippi in the 1920s seeking employment, also found himself at the American Sugar Refinery. It was here in 1934 that he witnessed the birth of what would become the Four Great Wonders Quartet. And that's how, basically, you know, that's how they started harmonizing on the job. They'd start work at 7:30 in the morning and they would work till 12. Then they'd have a half hour for lunch. They'd run, eat a little bit, and get behind a pile of sugar and harmonize. The style of these early community-based Jubilee quartets encompass a well-blended, closed, four-part harmony sound. A limited amount of solo singing, basic harmonic arrangements, and no instrumentation. They sang spirituals, jubilees, and hymns in the traditional call-response structure. Other male quartets in New Orleans that performed in this earlier Jubilee style were the Osceola Five, the Second Zion Four, the Duncan Brothers, and the Humming Four. This tradition was primarily male-dominated.
So this is Mahalia's first big hit. It's actually not the Dorsey song. I'm sure a lot of you know Move On Up a Little Higher. And I hope it's not sacrilege to just play a minute of this song and not the whole thing, but let's take a listen here. This is Mahalia. Bounce right there. That's the syncopated rhythm that's coming up there. I want to focus on voice, but the contrast here with Sally Martin's, who was also a song plugger for Dorsey and stayed with him throughout most of his life. Same song, almost the same year, Mahalia 47. Here's Sally singing the refrain from Move On Up a Little Higher in 1950.
Just then, soon as my feet start tired, then I'm going to lay down my heavy burden. Then I'm going to down the road and glory. Then I'm going to shout and tell the story. Then I'm going to move on up a little higher. I'm going to move on up a little higher. Yes, I'm going to move on up to glory. Till we fall, till we fall.
I was raised, like a lot of us, I'm sure, not to speak ill of the dead. I don't mean to say anything by that comparison, but Mahalia's voice is so singularly resonant and you get the contrast there, right, on that same song, the rhythm, the bounce in the first version, and Mahalia's incredible sense of control, and actually control of what for a lot of people was a radical new approach to singing. There's a great, he passed away a few years ago, historian of gospel music, Horace Boyer, who talks about gospelizing a melody, very similar to
Races, but majority black, African American, African ancestry. To them it never mattered. It was the person, the soul, but everybody knew that it was all drawing on the black American experience. Nobody ever tried to deny that. I mean, as far as music culture in America, all music culture in America is black American music. Without that recognition, you have no understanding whatsoever where the music comes from. You know, that's all I'll say.
I think what she is saying, like Adelia, because I have a granddaughter and I have a 14-year-old daughter. And I've never ever heard of Adelia before. And so they're in and pop, and then this time I'm like, whoa, who is that singing? She sounds good. And they said, oh, look. And they showed me a picture of her. So I think what you're trying to say is that he's giving credit to a white American, but the thing is, this white American is someone who's actually anointed, just like that Mahalia Jackson was. So she had, what he's saying is that she picked that spirit up from her ancestors. It doesn't matter, like you say, what color we are. It's just that that spirit was picked up, and that her voice speaks like and sounds like just an anointed voice.
So in other words, it's like the OJs and Harlan Oates singing that song, oh, this is a white guy trying to do a black guy thing. And yeah. So it's kind of like
I think the question of whether Adele is anointed or whether is an open question. I don't raising it.
I've been members of many churches. I think there was Pastor Webster up here. I was a minister of music at his church throughout the city of New Orleans, throughout Washington, D.C., Maryland, Virginia. Sang in Europe, singing gospel. I sang in Brazil, toured Brazil, singing.
It will stand, it will never die. There's a legacy of gospel music here. There's a legacy of gospel music in my family. Everyone in my family played some type of gospel music. We have a lot of pastors that in my family that played gospel music. The Jennifords down from the Ninth Ward, they all played gospel music. My brother, Reverend Tilton, he plays gospel music. My aunt, Mrs. Daisy Edinburgh, she had a printing shop. She played gospel music, all of her children, so it's just in our family. Gospel music, if we get together as a family and eat dinner on Sundays, maybe we had just left church, but we had to play some type of gospel music. Everybody had to sing a song after we finished eating dinner. That was a tradition in our family. And the younger people didn't understand. We just got out of church. Why do we have to eat? And now we've got to sing again. And now they're doing it with their children and their grandchildren. It's a tradition that goes on in the family. And my grandmother gave me my first 50 cents to learn to play music, and then she sent me over to Xavier's Junior School of Music.
It was mentioned about tradition. The type of gospel music that I continue to sing and hold the torch in is the traditional gospel music. And there is gospel music, but you have the hip hop, you have the contemporary, you have all the different name and more, I would say perhaps popular gospel, but the type that Mahalia did, the type that we're talking about that we grew up on was traditional gospel music. That gospel music that you just stood flat-footed and you sang. You didn't have the electronics like we have now. You had to have the electronics here. You had to have the electronics here in the heart. And the hands and the feet and the movement is what kept the rhythm. A lot of times, I remember the church I was attending, the minister did not at that time allow drums in the church. That was not allowed. The choir would sing, but we had to make our own rhythm with, and even in the Baptist church, there were times that you couldn't even have a tambourine. That was going to sanctify. So the choir played and still plays a very intricate part in the church. The choir sets the mood. The choir sets the atmosphere. The choir sets the tempo of the church. When the pastor's about to preach, the choir has set that platform that has opened the hearts of the people and allowed them to be able to receive the word from God. The music that the choir sings, the gospel music, does this and plays such an important part in the church then and today.
Amen.
And Dr. White, my last question would be, if it seems religious music would require liturgical texts or biblical words, can you play instrumental music, a clarinet, that it seems like when you play that is spiritual music, even though it may be a song that isn't related to Christianity or the church? Is there a way through your instruments that there's a relationship with God or with religious music?
Well, in jazz, New Orleans jazz, music of the church is an important part of the repertoire. You don't have, in the classic recordings of the 1920s, you don't have Louis Armstrong, King Oliver, Sidney Bechet playing hymns, but they did play them before they left. But in 1927, a group known as Sam Morgan's Jazz Band recorded the first hymns in New Orleans jazz style, and they were up-tempo hymns, Over in the Glory Land, Down by the Riverside, and Sing On. And the smaller bands were playing that, but the brass bands always played religious music. So I learned about that when I got into the brass bands. I realized when I would listen to people sing, like Irma Thomas, Jackson, I realized that I started playing with a lot of older musicians, and a lot of the people, I was very, very blessed. I played with more than 36 musicians that were born before 1910. Some of them, the oldest one was born in 1897. And they all had a very special sound, and I started to realize that the same sound that they had on those instruments was the same sound that gospel singers used. And then I realized that, we played a lot of hymns and things like that, and yeah, it's a very spiritual thing. And I feel that there's not a distinction between jazz and blues and gospel music, not in the sense of, church and secular, but that you can get a spirit and a feeling that's very important. I think it's all a gift from God. Incredible spirit. I mean, it just, you talk about getting taken over by the Spirit, it was just an amazing thing. But that rhythm was so powerful, just that one bass drum and that arm. It was incredible. So I think, the tradition of using different musical instruments in the church started with the sanctified churches, tambourines, and different instruments, drums and all of that. So I think that predated last year, I believe.
I saw a hand up earlier. Go ahead.
Question. I have two questions, actually. One is, would you consider gospel, like baseball and jazz, to be a uniquely singular U.S. innovation, United States innovation? Or are there influences from Wellesley and British hymns, or hymn writers, or the Caribbean and African heritage? Or is they consider jazz and baseball, saying that, if America brought two things to the world, it's jazz and baseball, everything else has influence somewhere else. Is gospel in that category as well? My second question would be, just for us godless San Franciscans, sanctified and unsanctified, can you give us the
Well, my experience with sanctified, because my mom was sanctified and my father was Methodist, but they had church very similar. The only difference between church at my dad's church and church at my mom's church, the people in the sanctified church was more physically, they were more physical involved in their gathering, as opposed to my dad was rather reserved. But still, they didn't have a choir per se in the sanctified church. It was more of a unison singing there. But in the Methodist church where my dad attended, it was more organized, and we had choirs. Like she said, I went from the young people's choir to the junior choir to the adult choir. And when I went to the country to live with my father's mom, they had a Methodist choir, and they didn't have any instruments, but it was just as lively as if we were in the sanctified church. So I didn't know until I was an adult that there was a difference. We enjoyed praising God, and that's how we did it. Some of them did it physically, and some of them was reserved. It's just a matter of choice. We weren't expected to be anything that we didn't feel sincerely, because it wasn't a show. It was our way of expressing thanks to God.
My experience with Sanctified, we grew up with some friends. I never was a member of a sanctified church, and I never played the instrument, the organ, or the piano there. And one particular reason is because in a sanctified church, when I attended it, they can take one song and hold that one song for half an hour to 45 minutes. And do you know how tired I would be playing that piano for a half an hour, 45 minutes? That is what the Lord has blessed me. I've brought gospel music into the Episcopalian, the Lutheran, the Catholic, my reputation precedes me. DC, and when they want a gospel choir, they know that I'm there, they want me to come and play. But the Sanctified was one that I never played for. But I do know that their way of, similar to basically what Sister Jackson said, but their way of living also they felt was more holy than the Baptist or the Catholic. They were more sanctified, they were more closer to God, it was more of the Spirit and the Holy Ghost that controlled their lives. So that's what, I hope I was answering your question a little bit more for you, what made that difference. Their life, they felt, was more sanctified and set apart than a Baptist or a Catholic. They were more holy than we were.
Right. They would say that they were saved and sanctified in the Holy Ghost, and they constantly emphasize that state of thinking about the state of being saved. Not to be saved later on, you had to be saved right now. And they emphasize that. But in terms of the church and the services, there is extreme emotionalism. And a lot of the people in the church, they do sing, like Sister Jackson said. They sing, but a lot of people bring tambourines, they play tambourines, and some of the reverends play guitars. Okay.
Anyone sing gospel the way Sister Irma sang gospel that day. And we went. All I could do was shout, hallelujah. Thank you, Lord. And we found the priest on the ship. And he confessed that he loved the Lord and he needed to be saved right at that time. And that was the most enjoyable cruise I've ever taken. Because that had never happened before when I had taken a cruise. Well, we had never done it.
We had not. It came about because the cruise took place in January. It was called the Legendary Blues Cruise. It took place in January, and Roger Neighbor, who's the producer of it, decided since it was in January, he wanted to do a tribute to Dr. Martin Luther King. And he asked if I would be amenable to sing some gospel music. I said, sure, Diana, play for me. We only had her and I. She had the B3 and I was there, and we didn't even have a set list, which I don't work from a set list anyway. I started to, because when I don't, I forget what I'm going to be doing. But we got up there, and for 45 minutes, all these folks who were blues people never moved. And when she told me after the fact what the young man had said and done, I told her, I said, Diane, we did what we were supposed to do. It happens, and that's all we want. If we can just get one to admit that something special happened to them, that's what all of us are about. We like the money because it pays the bills, but our main objective is to sing the praises and let people be understanding of why we sing the praises. I have a lot to be thankful for. For years, I was a single mother with 4 kids. I didn't know where my next meal was going to come from. I had a job, but I bought a house. So I said, God is magnificent. He's omnipotent. You can always depend on him. That's all I had. And until this day, that's my way of saying thank you. And I will always be happy to sing gospel music. But don't ever ask me when I'm doing a blues show, because it ain't going to happen.
I have a memorable experience that I had. I was working a jazz brunch that I did for many years with Greg Stafford at the Intercontinental Hotel. And I'll never forget this Sunday. He won't forget it either, I'm pretty sure. There was a group from Scandinavia that had brought a gospel singer from New Orleans to sing with their band, which is a popular thing to do, bring gospel singers to sing with the jazz bands. And sometimes there are entire church concert tours. So they had this singer, and we had never heard of her, but she was from New Orleans. They found her in a church somewhere.